This is Alistair Coburn. You're listening to Agile Uprising Podcast.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Agile Uprising Podcast. Today I'm your host, Troy Lightfoot, and I have with me a co-host, Jay Hrsko. I think that's how you say your name, right, Jay?
Close enough to work.
Okay. How actually do you pronounce it, if you don't mind sharing?
Hrsko, like the C is silent.
Okay, Hrsko. All right, cool. So Jay and I are going to be talking about the role of a Scrum Master, and particularly in Agile transformations, because I'm coaching in enterprise Agile transformations, and Jay is doing the same. I'm consulting, and Jay's a full-time employee, so there's a bit of a different dynamic there, but I think there's some parallels to what we've been seeing most likely. So at the company I'm currently at, I've been here about a year. I'm working with a group of Scrum Masters who are really, in my opinion, doing a great job at embracing the role as it's meant to be, according to the Scrum Guide. And not only just according to the Scrum Guide, but impacting demonstrable change on their teams. And not only just on the teams, but making a really positive influence in the organization. So I just wanted to bring that. It's kind of like a little case study, a small little case study about what's been going on with the groups I've been coaching. And maybe, Jay, you can share some of your observations, good or bad. It's totally up to you.
Sure.
Right?
Sure.
So the first thing I can say about a lot of the Scrum Masters I'm working with is they are continuous learners. So they have a beginner's mindset, and I think that's really required of any Scrum Master, of any coach, because you always think, okay, so what can I be learning today, and what can I be teaching the team, or what can I be coaching, and how can we always be improving? And I think I'm seeing a lot of success with that. So I have kind of a number of things that we've been working on with this group of Scrum Masters. And the first one is facilitation. So a lot of people think, okay, the Scrum Master is a facilitator. So what does that mean? Does that mean that we set up Jira and we just read through the stories, or we just do what went well to what didn't go well on a Trello board or something, right? A lot of people have an idea that's what facilitation is. Facilitation is actually a professional facilitation is a profession, and it's a competency to be developed. So we've really been focusing on, okay, how do we grow competencies in facilitation in the Scrum Master role? Because one of the, I'm going to say, misunderstandings about a self-organizing team is that you just say, okay, you're self-organizing now, and then boom, the team's going to be effective.
Right.
So,
right.
A self-organizing team needs a strong facilitator, because if you think about it, if you're going through a transformation where teams are used to being told what to do and they do it, versus now they're expected to come up with their own solutions, and as a group, and people have a hard time going through. You've probably seen a lot of meetings you're in, right? People go around in circles, they don't come to decisions, they get in fights, or people check out, they're disengaged, and you don't really get the buy-in from everyone in the group, maybe a few people. So it really takes strong facilitation to get through that. And actually we call that the groan zone in facilitation. So there's this idea of divergence and convergence, and divergence is basically gathering ideas, and convergence is converging on a single idea or whatever you're trying to accomplish in that meeting. And then everything in between is the groan zone. So what we've been focusing on is, how do we, every single meeting that we're in, that the Scrum Master is a facilitator on, how do we make that the most effective possible? If we're asking 10 people to spend an hour in this room, then we damn sure better make sure that this meeting is effective for all 10 people in this room. So it's really about embracing that and thinking about always constantly improving. So we use things like facilitation guides, which are essentially prep materials for every meeting. And these guides have a number of things on them. There are prep work. We use something called a power start, which is It stands for purpose, objectives, deliverables, what's in it for me, engagement, and roles and responsibilities. So before we facilitate any meeting, we have to think through something called the Power Start. And then essentially what that's doing is the P for purpose is thinking about, okay, what's the purpose of this meeting? That's number one. And then you're thinking it through that, okay, I actually have to write this thing out on paper or digitally or whatever, right? The second thing is think through is what are we trying to achieve? What are the outcomes and what are the deliverables? And we focus on 3 different types of deliverables. So the deliverables are head, hand, and heart. So every meeting usually has some kind of knowledge transfer, right? Or some new knowledge gain, some action items, which is the hand. And then heart is, if we want this meeting to be effective, it should be able to resonate with an emotional impact. So whether that's inspiration, whether that's empathy, whether that's motivation, whatever. But what we don't want is people bored. Okay, so how do we get people emotionally invested in the meeting? So thinking about all those things. And before I go any further, I'll say one more thing about the W, and that's essentially, why should someone show up to this meeting? Aside from the purpose, what's in it for them? Almost like a sales pitch. So before we facilitate any meeting, we have to create a sales pitch as to why people would show up to this thing in the first place. What's the benefit?
Right.
And then we have to think through how we facilitate in such a way for every attendee to feel engaged and achieve those 3 types of deliverables. Now, I don't know, Jay, I'm going to stop talking. I've been talking a while. So
no, you're fine. You're fine.
So this is a topic of facilitation. So this is something that the Scrum Masters I've been working with currently at this client are really embracing. They're spending a lot of time thinking about this and developing a competency in this, not just taking it as a whim, that's something we do because we have like sprint retro, right? So
right,
go ahead, Jay.
right. So I'll say this, going back to your leading statement, right, is you said that you work with a lot of Scrum Masters who are very interested in the concept of continuous learning and continuous development and honing skill. It is my personal opinion that most people are inherently lazy when it comes to their own career. They just are. Right. I think there's a large chunk of the working populace, especially that I've encountered in the white collar world, that is totally happy with where they are, and they don't want to grow and they don't want to change, which is fine. Right. Truth be told, one of the reasons why I enjoy working with you, Troy, and everybody else in the group is that it's forced me to take my career more seriously and to actually learn, and to the point where it's become fun. So I'll leave that where that lies. But your point about facilitation is very interesting, right? Because there's a big difference between a facilitator and a meeting steward. So a lot of the people you run into are meeting stewards, especially if you come from, and I come from this background, a very heavy project manager, Six Sigma PMP type background. You're not facilitating. They say they're facilitating a meeting, which is in actuality facilitating a conversation between vested parties to derive a shared goal, a shared result, or instead they're just meeting stewards. Okay, I take attendance, I run through my bulleted list of items, I open it up for questions, and then I adjourn the meeting. And it becomes this almost rote sort of muscle memory, step 1, step 2, step 3 complete. Right. Whereas facilitation it ties to that Cantor stuff that you talked about. It ties to someone who has the ability to read a room, who can actually walk in and within the first 5-10 minutes of listening to people talk, understands how to shepherd a conversation to, like you talked about, the growth zone, right? Shepherding the conversation through those peaks and valleys and those uncomfortable, almost confrontational truths you have between attendees to end at a relative mean, where people are all marching along the same path and at the same pace and agreeing, right? That's a difficult skill. It's a lot like public speaking, where some people naturally are good at it, some people are naturally horrible at it, but for most of us, it just takes some practice. And I think you're right in the sense that unless you are not even trained, but just educated, right? Because there's a difference between education and training. Well, if you're educated about this is a way that you should be looking at your session, and you bring up the whiff of, right? What's in it for me? Nothing is worse than having people show up to a meeting and in the first 5 minutes they derail it by saying, "Why am I here?" Right? Nothing takes the air out of a meeting, especially in corporate America. We're a very heavy meeting-centric culture. Nothing brings any more air out of the meeting, especially when that person is someone of repute, someone who's of a higher stature in the company, if they're looked upon as a leader, whether they demonstrate capability or not, if they walk in and say, why am I here? All the air goes right out of the meeting, just right out of it. And you're basically, if you're the facilitator, even if you're the coordinator, right? You're sunk. You're sunk before you even started. Because once the person, the hippo, right? Once the hippo in the room is saying, why am I here? You have even the lowly person saying, well, if he doesn't know why he's here, why am I here? And then you're just, you're lost. You're lost. It's a very tough skill to understand how to herd people in the same direction, especially when you have a lot of very strong personalities who have a lot of strong opinions.
So love it. Okay. I totally agree. So I just wanted to piggyback on that and make sure that we explain what HIPPO means to some folks who might not know. It just stands for highest paid person's opinion. So just wanted to clarify.
Good point. Good clarification.
One of the things that we teach in regards to facilitation, and a lot of the Scrum Masters working on it, like I've been saying, is that we need to, for every section of the meeting, we divide it by sections, and we think about, engagement early, and this concept of divergence and convergence and the growing zone and all those things. So every section needs to have a question, and then that question, we need to answer it ourselves. And then so for instance, like we create a question-based agenda, is what we do. Right? So if you can kind of prep your meeting by instead of sending out an agenda, send out a bunch of questions that are going to be answered in the meeting. So it kind of starts the meeting before the meeting starts. So it actually gets people thinking about the questions before they come into the meeting, right? It's kind of one thing. Another thing that's really important is to think through meeting dysfunctions ahead of time. So an example of that is there's a lot of different types of dysfunctions. So you have your electronics Eddie. That's a little name we call people who are constantly on their laptop and their phones, right? You can come up with any of these things. Checked out Charlie, whatever names you want to call, right? different people. Like I'm sure you've all seen it in meetings. Some people are not paying attention. They're on their emails. Some people are on their phones. Some people are constantly late. Some people talk the whole time. Some people never talk. There's all kinds of dysfunctions. Now, if you go back to the Cantor model of looking for a balance between all four types, right? And if you haven't heard that episode, I highly recommend you guys go check out Getting Teams Unstuck with William Stryden, that podcast about the Cantor model. And that's some things that go into effective facilitation, getting through the growing zone there. But facilitation is real work, actually. Because what you have to do is, in fact, I'm going to back up for a second. They say that professional facilitation generally takes about 2 times prep for whatever the meeting length is. So if you have a 1-hour meeting, you should be preparing for 2 hours. Give an example. So preparing might be things like creating your facilitation guides, thinking about different convergence and divergence facilitation techniques, but also thinking through all those dysfunctions. And what are you noticing on your teams? What are the different dysfunctions and how do you address them? Because some of them you may address in meetings. And the way you would do that is you would try to prep your facilitation in a way to eliminate those dysfunctions.
So, Troy, I'm going to interrupt you for a second because I have a question. I want to go back to how you're talking about sectioning meetings because I think that's important. However, you just made an interesting remark. You said that effective facilitators spend double the duration of a meeting doing preparation, right? So if I have a 1-hour meeting, that means I spend 2 hours of prep, right? Facilitation guides, dysfunctions you can expect, so on and so forth. Do you have any tips or pointers, or do any tips or pointers exist for someone who works in an environment like myself, like some others we know, where we come from a very heavy meeting culture? Now, obviously, we're both going through transformation, right? So there's going to be more meetings than less until we get to a point where the lean agile mindset has taken hold. But if you had to give someone pointers and say, look, Jay, I know you don't have the time to spend 2 hours for a 1-hour meeting because you have 6 1-hour meetings a day. What would you say, Troy, are the key things that someone should really concentrate on in order to facilitate a great session, get the most value, and get people in and out as quickly and efficiently as possible?
Okay, so I'm going to back up. I'm going to write what you just said there. If our meetings were more effective, we probably wouldn't need as many of them.
Seconded. Second.
So what I mean is, if people treated this like real work, like a real competency, we probably would need less. Okay. So I would encourage you to try it out. I mean, there's a lot of stuff online about facilitation and professional facilitation you can look into. There's some courses you can take, and maybe we can link in the details if people are interested in that. But saying all that, what would I focus on? So dysfunctions is a big one. Okay. And parts of thinking through dysfunctions is sometimes you may actually have to go do some one-on-one coaching with people before the meeting starts, actually, to prep a dysfunction or to prepare for it. You might not be able to facilitate your way around it, okay? Like in meeting. So part of the prep is literally prep work before that meeting happens. So an example would be, let's say that you're facilitating a meeting and you notice there's a team member who always kind of leads the conversation and doesn't let others share opinions and kind of drive that, right? So yeah, there are facilitation techniques which you can do to eliminate that. You could do things like silent writing, brainstorming using silently without talking. There's a bunch of different things you can do, but maybe it's just a one-on-one conversation about the behavior of that person and how, in order to have an effective meeting, in order to have effective collaboration, we really need to have multiple perspectives. So you might need some coaching there. So that's when coaching skills kind of come into play. So all that, your question was, if you only had a short amount of time, what would I focus on? So I would focus on a sales pitch. So what is a sales pitch I can send out? That's the what's in it for me thing, right? That I could send out in an email that when someone reads this, they're actually going to want to show up to my meeting. That's what I would focus on. And that will help frame probably the rest of it, and that will make it easier. Right? Because if you can get that going, you can probably run it effectively.
Okay. I think that's interesting. I get that. So one of the things, so you were going back a little bit, you talked about sectioning your meetings, right? So each section has a question and you should send out questions to be answered beforehand. I actually think that's brilliant because people walk into meetings expecting to discuss a solution. Where if you walk in and say, we're going to discuss a question, that actually ties to the episode, I think it was Colleen and Chris Merman just did about flow-based roadmaps, where I think it was Matt and Melissa talked about how we should make roadmaps based upon our problems. And they should start with the problem that we're going to solve, not with a solution, but we should roadmap, okay, I'm going to address this problem, then this problem, then that problem. So by along those same lines, by sending out a meeting invite where you list out the questions you're going to answer, I think that does create not just a whiff of maybe, but curiosity. And if you get, let's be honest here, with information technology, with some of the big businesses that you or I have crossed paths on, there are a lot of people who are functioning at a I like to think a high level. There are also people who aren't. If you poke that curiosity button, they'll show up because they're just morbidly curious to see, okay, well, how are we going to answer this question? Because 9 times out of 10, the 10 people walking in the room have 10 different ideas in their head walking in about how to solve it. So that's where I think to bring it round, your facilitation skill comes in. It's taking those 10 different opinions of solution and melting them into one uniform approach that everybody agrees on.
Right. I totally agree.
It's much easier said than done. Let's be honest here. It's much easier.
Definitely. It's really hard to get a group of people who all have differing opinions, maybe, or some people don't want to share opinions. They're maybe checked out. They're not engaged. Some people are too engaged, meaning they overtake the meeting, right? To get a group of people to try to, what we call is create the container. So facilitation is all about just creating a container. The content is theirs. So it's like, this is their meeting, not mine. But how do I guide them to effectiveness? That's the question, right? That's what facilitation is all about. And that's what one of the roles of a Scrum Master is every meeting and everything this team is doing, how can it be more effective? That's a constant question. And that's that's one of the focus should be on.
Right. And if you would forgive me this, I'm going to take us down a little bit of a rabbit hole. To all of our listeners, if they have the ability, Edward Tufte, I think is his name, Tufte, Tufte, He is a guy who writes a lot of books on complicated data displays and how to take very complex, large sets of data and display them in a way that make them easily consumable by people who may not necessarily have familiarity with the background information or the raw data you're speaking of. I attended a lecture of his in Philly, and he talked about how PowerPoint is evil. Right. And he had a whole rant about how PowerPoint is evil. Actually, there's the excerpt from his book, and we'll put it in the show notes. You can purchase as a PDF. It's worth it. But he talked about how the way he runs meetings, which a lot of the big Silicon Valley firms use, is, a lot of times you walk in with a PowerPoint and you walk everybody through their slides. And the problem with that is you're assuming that everyone has the same level of cognition. So you're assuming that Jay, Troy, and the 10 other people in the room all read at the same speed, all comprehend at the same speed, and all can synthesize and formulate questions at the same speed. So his suggested way of working, which a lot of the companies that he consults at have started to use, is when you walk into a meeting, you sit down and you give everybody a memo, somewhere between 2 and 3 pages, single spaced. And he goes on, there's a whole other tangent Tuft can give you about how the most high definition form of communication is a piece of paper. But he says, start your meeting with 10 minutes of silent reading. And then from there, you then go around the room and say, okay, Troy, based upon the material, what questions do you have? And his studies have shown that it reduced meetings by an hour-long meeting, it's cut down to about 38 minutes. He said because people are reading at their own pace, they will write down their questions. They will come to a certain point where, okay, I want to ask about this, but I don't really need to ask about this. And it gives everyone in the room a chance to analyze and synthesize and then come out with a question at their own pace, as opposed to having to follow along with slides where maybe they were still reading the previous slide and you went forward. Sorry to take this down that side. We'll link to his course in the show notes. You get all 4 of his books. It's brilliant. But that really made me think about how PowerPoint is the dumbest thing in the world to try and facilitate, because you're basically treating people like they're children, and you're walking them through, and nothing's better than when you go to a meeting and somebody reads the slide verbatim. It's like that Geico commercial where the James Bond archetype is in the chair. Did you see it, Troy? Right. And the villain pulls out a PowerPoint. I burst out laughing every time that comes on.
So I'm going to have to go take that course now, Jay. Just letting you know.
Oh, it's worth it. It's worth every cent.
All right. So that's going to piggyback into the next thing that I've seen some great Scrum Masters doing in growing their competency is coaching. So there's this concept that people think coaching is just people telling each other what to do. And in fact, that's pretty much the opposite. That's more like teaching. Okay. So coaching is unlocking the person you're coaching or entity, because we tend to call a team like an entity, because a team it's not a person, but you can coach a team as a whole as well as the individuals. So it's kind of like unlocking their potential without influencing your ideas necessarily. So the difference between coaching and teaching. So if I come into a team, right, as a coach, and I just go, do this, do that, do this, do that, right? Okay. As opposed to asking them some questions, hearing them out, and getting them to come up with their own solutions, which will solve their own problem. So Scrum Master is a similar thing, and Scrum Master is supposed to be a coach to the team and a coach to the organization, which is one of the hardest parts of the Scrum Master job, actually. Because you kind of have to coach leadership as a Scrum Master, because one of your job responsibilities is trying to make the environment for the team as effective as possible. And that will require organizational change skills, which is, if you think about it, probably the hardest thing you can ask anybody to do, in my opinion.
Oh, it absolutely is.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So going back to coaching for a second is there's this idea that, Jay, if you and I have a conversation and you're the one who comes up with the solution for it versus if I give you the solution, the odds of you following through with it if I give it to you versus if you come up with it are a lot higher if you come up with it and it's sticking. Right? So there is an art to unlocking that ability in people that it's really not an easy thing. It's a skill that I'm still working on as a coach. I'm working on it every day, and it doesn't even have to really have anything to do with Agile per se. It's just that we tend to use it in Agile coaching. So That's a skill that a lot of the Scrum Masters I've been working with, that's something they're working on with their teams. And it was funny because I run these Scrum Master cohorts every week at this current client. And I've been teaching them about coaching and the difference between coaching and teaching and mentoring. They're different. And we did this example where I took one of the Scrum Masters who volunteered, and he had 15 minutes to coach me through a problem. Okay. Now I already taught them the basics of coaching and asking powerful questions and trying not to give solutions right away and trying to unlock it from the person you're coaching. So we went through all that, a couple weeks worth of stuff, cohorting, if you want to call it that, right? And so I had him come up in front of all the Scrum Masters, and I sat there, and he had no idea what my problem was. Right? And I came up with a problem that he was going to have to coach me to a solution in 15 minutes, right? So and then what the problem was something personal. It had nothing to do with work, and he had no idea what it was. And he actually, and I was kind of vulnerable in front of everybody, but he actually coached me through a problem, and I came to a solution which I implemented in real life, and it worked. And he had no idea. He had no idea about this personal problem. He had no experience with it at all, but it worked. And I had not thought of that solution before we went through that 15-minute coaching session.
That's awesome.
So,
that's a not to flog your ego, but that's a testament to your abilities as a coach that you were able to imprint that way of thinking onto someone who's actually he basically used your own weapon against you, which is actually pretty funny. So you touched on something, Troy, though I want to cover up. You talked about how, the goal of coaching, right, is you want to unlock, I think your words were unlock the team's potential, the person's potential without influencing their ideas, right? So you basically want to talk them through you want to plant the seed to talk them through to have them walk through its own germination in their own mind, right? And you also talked about someone should come up with their own solutions to solve their own problems. Now, as people who coach in the enterprise space, because Andrew Leff always says we don't coach Agile, we coach people, right? This a lot of times leads to frustration on behalf of the client, right? And it can lead to frustration on behalf of the people we were actually hired to coach, where they're expecting us to come in and say, the pen is blue. Whereas as a coach, you don't want to tell them the pen is blue. You don't even want to hint that the pen is blue. You want them to you want to ask them questions to get them thinking and analyzing so they can decide for themselves, okay, the pen is blue. So how do you get around those type of scenarios where, and I know you've seen it, where people get frustrated? It's like, Troy, I just want you to give me the answer. What's your rebuttal to that? What's a Scrum Master who's learning to really master their craft? How do they in that scenario, how do they answer that?
So a Scrum Master or a coach has 4 specific competencies that they can grow in. Okay, there's more, but I'm talking about 4. So one is coaching, which we're talking about right now. The first one we talked about was facilitation, right? The third one we haven't really talked about is teaching. Okay? So what you're talking about is like teaching. So we do this thing this way. This is why we do it. Here's the fundamentals. That's part of it, right? The fourth one we haven't really talked about is mentoring. So mentoring is similar to coaching, except throughout the coaching conversation, you may give suggestions based off of past experience. But the thing is, past experience doesn't necessarily equal success for someone else's experience.
Right? I'm sure we have a bunch of friends who are part of the divorce club that maybe we should be coaching each other on relationships.
Yeah. So yes. So what I mean is, I could have experienced thing in my past, right, and it worked for me, but that context could be completely different for that person or that team. So I can give you my experience and say, try this out, right? And you may go try it and it may work. But guess what? If I can get you to come up with your own solution for your own context and own it, and then actually do it and see it through, and then if it works, that's going to stick with that person forever, right? So, and that's going to be their own experience that they can use for mentoring in the future, not my experience that they can use for mentoring. Does that make sense?
Right. No, it makes sense.
Yeah. So what I tend to do is I usually tend to take, if it's a brand new team or someone that's very inexperienced, you usually have to mentor them at first, generally, because they won't know how to come up with their own solutions, right? So you'll ask them some questions, you'll dive into it. You'll say, hey, I've done this in the past. This is what has worked for me. What do you think about trying it out? They go experiment with it. And as they get some experience, then you can start going into more of a coaching mode where now they kind of know how to start to solve their own problems. But at first, people need that mentoring usually. And sometimes just straight up teaching. So that's why all three of those things, there's a balance there. And it's really about finding the balance of every person in your team you're working with is going to require a different balance. And I don't want to tie this back to spiral dynamics, but that's another podcast.
We'll get there. We'll get there.
Yeah. So anyway, so I think the answer to your question is really about understanding which role to play at the time. Because if you're only coaching and you never give any suggestions, then that's not going to work. The coaching stuff works with people who are experienced the most. Like if you're working with someone who has experience, then coaching is probably the most effective way because you know that they can probably come up with their own solutions if you can unlock it for them. Newbies, though, you may have to mentor them through it. That's
right.
That might be the right approach. Yeah.
So speaking of coaching, mentoring, the 4 quadrants of coaching, I know you and I have discussed this topic before, but the T-GROW model, which I'm a big fan of. You talk about how there's a stickiness to you coming up with your own solution versus me telling you what to do. And we'll put our show notes are going to be wild for this episode because we're covering a lot of ground. But I learned of the T-GROW model in a class I took at a previous employer about it was actually coaching employees. It was a management course. So it wasn't agile coaching per se. It was how to manage employees and how to deal with tough situations. And I actually turned around and used this model on my boss who was having a tough time solving something. And all I did was talk him through it. And at the end, when he figured out all the things because the 4 steps, for those of you that don't know, it's G is the goal, right? So where do I want to go? R is the reality. So where am I today? O is the options. What are my options to get me to the goal in my present reality? And then the what is the W. What do I do next? So after I talked my boss through this, by the time we got to the what, he looked at me and he said, Jay, you're brilliant. And I didn't even do anything. And I said to him, Joe, I didn't do anything. I'm just basically acting like the shrink, and I'm just talking through it. And he actually went and he did some of the things he tried to turn into policy, some of the things we came up with, and the ones that we did, it worked. So to your point about coaching, right? There is something to be said about you don't need to have all the answers because 9 times out of 10, like you said, like in your example, you came up with a problem that somebody may not even know how to solve themselves if it happened to them in their own life. But by benefit of walking through this type of conversational structure, or by benefit of helping poke the thought down the right lane, you end up with a solution where it's like, I didn't even know that was possible, but yeah, let's try that. Yeah. You're right, though. It's the whole idea of to send anybody down the nerd rabbit hole. If you ever read the David Gerald book, War Against the Cthulhu, it's a 4-book series. He talks about the idea in the book of clearing, right? And the example of clearing is one of the military leaders sits down with one of his officers, and they basically stare at each other and they talk through. And they're basically doing a coaching session without calling it a coaching session, like your example, where you'd be surprised, just the benefit of talking through things verbally, like not thinking about it in your own head, but forcing yourself to put it into words to express an idea or even a feeling. Not only does it add weight to what you're saying, but it also forces your brain to kick in and to start maybe solving that problem you're verbalizing, which is also why I'm a big fan of going to a psychologist. Even if you're totally normal and you think you're fine, just going to talk to a neutral third party and talking through what you're thinking, what you're feeling, you'd be surprised about the like you said, you talked about self-reflection, right? And being aware of your own shortcomings. That's a powerful thing, which I think as an adult is very hard for a lot of people. And before we switch off coaching, so 2 of the things we've covered as far as Scrum Masters advancing their craft, right? We've talked about facilitation. We've talked about coaching. The last tip on coaching I want to throw out there is if anybody likes to read, the Lisa Adkins book, Coaching Agile Teams, is a brilliant resource. I have mine as dog-eared and highlighted, and I have notes all over the place. And she really talks about the idea of coaching to a Scrum Master where you don't need to be some guy who's been dipped and had lots of experience. And it reads like an almost, not like a narrative like the Phoenix Project, but it reads very well. I have that thing on my desk and I refer to it constantly. It's a brilliant, brilliant resource.
Awesome. So Lisa has actually, it's a plug for her. I mean, we don't get anything for it, but basically she has some courses you can go to if you want to grow as a coach and a facilitator. Maybe we can link those two, right? Because she has coaching and facilitation courses, which you can help that kickstart your journey there if you're interested in this stuff. So I'm going to pivot to the next topic for some of the Scrum Masters I've been working with, and I'm seeing some really awesome success with this next topic, and that's metrics. So everyone's favorite topic, metrics, right? So what do we measure? Is velocity a metric? All these questions. A lot of typical Scrum Masters, they just use velocity as their only metric, right? So a primer for maybe a future podcast is that I've been coaching integral theory metrics, actually.
I'll listen to that one. I'm not going to be part of it because the last couple you blew my mind.
Okay, so we're not going to get too much into integral theory in this podcast, but I will say this: we are using a perspective of metrics across 4 different perspectives. So let me explain this. So basically, we're looking at, if you only measure one type of thing, okay, you're only going to get that thing, and other things are going to suffer, right?
Right.
If you only focus on velocity, you're only going to get either a couple things. You're either going to get more output, or you're going to get fudge numbers or gain velocity, right? Okay, it's stupid. It's not a metric. So
what was the quote Ryan Lockard had? Somebody said to him, "We need to double our velocity," and he said, "Fine, I'll double all the story point estimates."
Yeah, or I just say add a 0 if somebody wants that. So so the velocity ends up driving horrible conversations. So good metrics should drive good conversations, right? So simply put, without going too much into integral theory, the 4 different types of metrics we look at for the team are this, right? We have our team-based metrics, which are that we can be objective with, right? That we can actually use some scientific types of measurements. So for that, we end up usually using lean flow metrics. Okay, so things like cycle time, lead time, and throughput. Okay, even in a context of a Scrum team, we still use those metrics because we just established that velocity is not a metric. Right. So what do we measure? So those types of metrics end up driving good conversations about how do we improve our delivery. So velocity tends not to talk about how to improve our delivery. It just tends about how do we cram more stuff.
Right. It's a flat number. And by the way, just to let you keep going, I truly, Dan Vacanti's book, Vacanti, changed my life. Actionable Agile metrics, throughput, whip, cycle time. That's all that matters. I'm convinced that's all that matters. Like Scrum, Kanban, whatever. That's all you need to track in order to get true positive results. But continue.
Yeah, so I'm going to give you a perfect example of that, piggybacking off that. So I was working with a team who has an awesome Scrum Master and product owner, by the way, like great at what they do. They just needed some help when it comes to what to measure. Okay, so I presented some of these metrics for them. I showed them the value of it, how it could help their teams. We walked through it with their teams. We used an Excel sheet from Troy McGinnis, so shout out to Troy McGinnis, who we've had on the podcast before. So I use that like with every team that I introduce the stuff with. And maybe I can link this in the notes, the Excel sheet. So we use that, and the Excel sheet shows you basically everything you want to know about those types of metrics. It shows you your whip, your cycle time, your throughput, and every variation of those 3 things imaginable. Histograms, I mean, you have everything, right? So we introduced this, the Scrum Master and I, to her team a couple months back. Now, this team had never once met a sprint commitment. They're doing 2-week sprints, right? So they have always carried over work every single sprint. They've never been able to complete the work that they said they were going to do. Okay, that's the background. But their team dynamics are off the charts. Great team dynamics, right? Super green team, by the way, like it's Power Dynamics. So very awesome chemistry, a lot of fun on that team. I would love to be on the team if I was like a developer like that, you know? So, but they just needed some coaching when it comes to the measurement stuff. So we introduced it to them, we showed them the Excel sheet, and she put all the real data in there for the last quarter. And it was eye-opening to them because they saw a actual correlation between their WIP trending up and their cycle times increasing. And I showed them through the Excel sheet how that works. Okay. And then we talked about, you guys have such great chemistry. You're very technically skilled, but yet you can only deliver every 2 weeks in big batches. Right. And on top of that, you're not able to make the commitments that you're even doing in the first place. Right. So you guys have all the skills in the world, all the chemistry in the world. You look like a high-performing team from the outside, but you're not able to deliver only at most like 2 weeks at best, right? So I said, okay, so how do we fix that? So I showed that we use a lean pull metric. Dude, I'm not kidding you. 3 days into the sprint. Well, first let me talk about this. So we showed it to them because they're an awesome team, right? I asked them a few questions. The Scrum Master asked them a few questions. They came up with their own solutions that neither of us provided. And they decided their average WIP was 7 stories at a time. Okay. They came up with this thing where they were only going to do 2 stories at a time. Now, I told them, you're going to have to change the way you work to accomplish that. Are you willing to try it? And they said, yeah. So the Scrum Master and I showed them how to do some mob programming, and we just, we facilitate those things. So no lie, sprint starts, they pair and mob on everything, and they went from not able to deliver every 2 weeks, like as a commitment, to delivering in every single day. Okay.
Oh, wow.
So, yeah. So they actually were able to deliver every day. If you look at their burn down charts, so we stopped using story points for this team, and we just use stories, and they use a burn down chart at their daily stand up. And you can see every day they are finishing stories. They went from having a total like cliff at the end of every sprint to rushing to get it done, and demoing to the product owner at the sprint review, by the way, okay, to one of the process changes they realized they had to make to decrease the cycle time is to demo throughout the process every day. So they got buy-in from that. Just by using those metrics, they came up with all kinds of positive changes. So now, even though they had the technical capability of doing continuous deployment, they didn't have the process to do continuous deployment. But now they do, so they can deploy whenever the hell they want. That's my usual saying with the teams. They say, we wanted to be able to deploy whenever we want, not every 2 weeks, right? So how do we work in such a way to do that? So that's an example of using real metrics to drive team improvement, and we have like noticeable, demonstrable improvement of cycle time and throughput and lead time and delivery and quality too, actually, because we measure quality. So I don't know if you've had any experiences like that, Jay, but that's what's going on here.
Well, getting away from going back to those metrics, right? Getting away from the hard part, right? So it makes sense that, hey, if we slow down and we work on less things simultaneously. I think it was Troy McGinnis's quote is "Stop starting, start finishing." It was either him or Dave McCanty. I get the two of them. Their quotes are so close in the Venn diagram. I always get them confused. But it seems to be almost counterintuitive that, hey, we should slow down and work on less things at a time and we can get it done. And to your example, it's textbook, right? Where if teams slow down and concentrate on one thing at a time, you get more completion, you get more work through the system. However, the hard part with that, and let's be real here, the hard part with that is going up against management expectations or leadership expectations that are either on the front end of an agile transformation, or they're having an agile transformation inflicted on them by senior leadership, and they're not necessarily bought in. And you tell them, well, we're going to slow down and work on less things simultaneously. Usually that sends off alarm bells, and people go running for the hills and, Gonzo yelling, "Stop the presses," and the Muppets Take Manhattan. I think it was that movie. And that's very hard for a team to fight against, right? Because not only are you going against every single fiber of your being where each person gets their own story and you all just work as little silos on a big team. We're supposed to be supposed to be cross-functional. Getting out from under that management overhang of saying, hey, and this is where enterprise type coaching comes in with the stuff that you and I do is, hey, you got to give the team a minute. Right now you have them sprinting. They need to stop and slow down and start crawling again and reteach themselves how to crawl, because then when they sprint, they'll be 10 times faster. And that's I think that's a really tough battle to fight.
Well, here's the bad news for the Scrum Masters listening. That's their jobs, actually. So they are responsible for the team, for protecting the team, for developing a high-performing team, and also changing the way that others around the team impact that team. So therefore, if management is putting pressure on the team, they need to be the ones to go and actually coach the leadership or management about why the team is working this way and protect the team from that so they can be high performing. It's really, really, really difficult. So when I see people think that Scrum Master job is just Jira and retros, I'm like, you don't understand.
Jira and retros.
Like, it takes a special person to be able to do all these types of things. Like, for real. Like, that's what I believe.
Right.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, I was agreeing, and I was going to say, part of the initial things we talked about with this episode was why do we see, which is a whole other episode, is why do we see some Scrum Masters struggle? That'll be part 2 of this, which we can do next week. But that's a whole different conversation. But Troy, you talked about metrics, and you said there's a couple of metrics you used, and I think I torpedoed your discussion. You started off with team-based metrics and how that ties to lean flow. What were the other metrics? Take us back on track. What were the other things you were talking about that you use as a metric yardstick?
So in integral theory, we have it's a 4-quadrant model, like any good model. Right? So it's just a joke. But basically, there's 4 different quadrants, and one of them is internal intangible quadrant, which is essentially your own knowledge, your own consciousness, your emotions, things like that, right? So that's going to be different for every type of person you're working with. So things that lie in that quadrant are internal knowledge-based competencies, right? So, like, if you're on a team, right, and you have certain skill sets that need to be grown out on that team, if you're the Scrum Master and you're observing this team, right? So because one of the job responsibility of a Scrum Master is to help coach the team be more cross-functional. Okay, so if you're looking at that perspective from a team and you say, okay, here's all the skill sets. How do we grow these skill sets across this team? Well, we need individuals to learn these skill sets. So one of your job is to try to figure out how to coach that and to grow that out. So one of the metrics we may use is actually, the amount of skills we have in certain skill sets that are lacking, the competencies in them, like, journeyman, apprentice, master, those types of competencies, right? People use those 3 things. And then how do we demonstrate that? And how do we what processes can we use? Can we put in place? Because Scrum Master is kind of a process position too, obviously. So what process can we put in place to help grow these out on the individuals on the team? Okay. The knowledge skill. So it's like knowledge-based metric, if you want to put it that way. So that's one thing. Another thing is team-based metrics that are more intangible. So for instance, like the company I'm coaching at now, they use something called ENPS, which is Employee Net Promoter Score. So they do a survey every quarter of how, if the employees would recommend their friends or anybody else if they would come work for this company. It's like NPS.
Right. I think most of our listeners are probably familiar with NPS because most companies use them.
So NPS and ENPS are lagging indicators. So they only show what happened after the fact, right? So there are things which you can measure, like leading indicators to ENPS, right? And that's things like, they might seem touchy-feely to some people, but that's things like intrinsic motivation, happiness, workplace life balance, these types of things. So there are tools which we use, like for instance, there's a website called Team Mood, which you can check out. That's a tool for this. We use something called Moving Motivators by Jürgen Appello. We use that to talk about, driving what's motivating us and what's demotivating us, and how can we improve that, things like that. So that's like an example of a leading indicator to hopefully better ENPS scores, right? Hopefully better work satisfaction and happiness at work. And then the last quadrant is system-based metrics, or organizational-based metrics. So like, for instance, if we have an impediment to raise to leadership, what's the lead time on that, right? So if it's something that as a Scrum Master, I can't remove that, maybe someone in leadership has to, right? Okay, so what's the lead time on impediment removal? Or How soon are we getting our requests fulfilled when it comes to things we need, as far as tools, as far as environments, things like that, right? So we can measure those types of things. And that's an example of more system-wide type of metrics, right? And then if you want to be technical about it, you can also do your DevOps type of, recovery metrics might lie there for your system, stuff like that, right?
Right. Failed builds per day, that sort of stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, so that lives in that. There's a lot of stuff that can live in that quadrant. So when we go into integral theory, we'll talk more about that in the future podcast. But basically, it's like you can't just measure one thing because they all affect one another. Right? So if you only focus on cycle time, then you can throw out your quality. Right? You can throw out your happiness because you'll just be burned out if you only focus on that purely. Right? So you have to focus on quality, delivery, work-life balance, satisfaction, growing competencies, making the team more cross-functional, which hopefully leads to better team dynamics. They all kind of work hand in hand together, right? So it's about, okay, so we measure things from different perspectives and try to get the best results. There's no magic formula to it, though. So it's just a matter of experimentation and trying to get the team to buy in these things, which is another job of the Scrum Master, which is also hard because sometimes people are just like, let me just do my job. So no one said that the job is easy, right?
It's really not, Troy. I mean, not to really, but that touches on a very important topic. I mean, so look at it this way. And you and I were just talking about this before we started recording. When organizations look at, well, we want to do Agile, right? Do the Agile. How do we start? The first thing they start with is Scrum Masters, getting people CSM certified, right? And it starts from the bottom. And everybody has to start somewhere, and nobody is brilliant out the gate. But there's a lot of a lot of companies, I should say, slot resources into the role. Oh, well, we're going Agile. You're no longer a PM, you're a Scrum Master. And, well, what's the difference? Well, you have to do, like you said, we use Jira, we do retros. And it's almost a disservice to the position itself because think about it, when we do hiring, seeing someone with the CSM on their resume, okay, well, they've taken the course. But then you really got to dig in, and there's no way of knowing without actually talking to this person for a good 20, 30 minutes to figure out if they're any good. Were they a Scrum Master in name only? Were they someone who was given the title of Scrum Master, but they were still acting as a project manager? Or were they truly embracing the mindset and talking the talk, walking the walk, being Agile, not just doing Agile? And that's it's rough. It's rough for a practitioner, right? Especially for someone who just gets shoehorned into a role. I mean, they need to find a way to succeed. And I don't envy it for anybody. I know it's got to be. Yeah.
So I got like maybe 3 more minutes left. I know we should wrap up soon. So I'll talk about real quick. I'll touch on transparency. So as any good Scrum Master should know, right? 3 pillars of Scrum: transparency, inspection, and adoption, right? So, by the way, a Scrum Master is meant to be a process expert. So they're supposed to be a quote unquote expert in process, meaning it's not like you go to a CSM and you call yourself an expert. Right? Like it's a constant learning journey, which you don't stop learning about how different processes can help drive effectiveness. So we talked about a few of them so far, right? So transparency is the key. So management, leadership, different people in the organization, if things are constantly transparent, they don't feel like things are hidden, and that actually drives the culture we want. So we can actually try to change the culture through some of our practices and processes. And one of them is making every single thing we do transparent. So even if we're using Jira, for example, right? Okay, Jira is fine, but the problem is Jira is not very visible to most people outside of the team. Okay? So how do we make what we're doing visible to anybody who wants to see it? Now, whether that's our team areas, whether that's our sprint reviews, we have our roadmaps up, we have sprint goals everywhere, whatever it is, it's about everything we do should be transparent so there's no hiding, okay? So that's one thing I've seen work. For instance, there's a few Scrum Masters I'm working right now who are like awesome at transparency. To be honest with you, even when I was a Scrum Master, I always thought about this, but they've come up with ideas that I hadn't even thought of. So really, really cool stuff. I'm like, wow, that's awesome. So this is an example of like everybody you're working with has this ability in them to do awesome stuff. And if I just come in there and tell them exactly what to do, I might have never seen that because they did something better than me in this example. Right. So
right.
Going back to the coaching. So anyway, transparency. And the last thing I'll talk about is team goals. So a lot of the Scrum Masters I'm working with, we're talking about short and long-term team goals because the organization is trying to be committed to keeping teams together for the long haul. Okay, so obviously we need product-related goals on the product side, but what about the team goals? How are we improving and how are we measuring ourselves in that? So that's things like so in the next 3 months, we need to get better at these couple skills because we think that'll help us be more cross-functional. In the next 12 months, we need to get better at this and that. So maybe we need to learn how to pair more or do some out programming or grow these skills or maybe the soft skills. I don't know. It's really up to the team what they want to do. But a good self-organizing team measures themselves and constantly tries to improve. So a Scrum Master's job is to help facilitate that as well and coach that.
Right. They should have. Scrum Masters should have some sort of not a development plan, but horizon plan. I'm like, okay, we do well at X, Y, and Z. However, A, B, and C were lacking. So, the next sprint, we're going to introduce no estimates. And then 2 sprints from that, we're going to do a strong and weak pairing. And then 2 sprints from that, maybe we'll dip our toes in mob programming, right? So, like you said, it's like everything else. You need to have some concept of where do I want to get to in the future? It's that whole, improvement kata. Let's look at where we are, look at where we want to be, make a change, reassess, and then keep going. And I think you're right. And that's probably a thing that a lot of Scrum Masters, especially who are learning the role, are so busy trying to get the process down that they don't really think about, okay, well, I really need to look at the team and see where can I help them go next. And that's where you get your truly transformative Scrum Masters.
Yeah, so I totally agree. So I'm pretty much done talking about this. I mean, I've been talking a while. So, so if you're still listening, I appreciate that. Hopefully you got something out of it.
No, I think this was a good conversation, Troy. I still am struggling for the episode title. We'll figure that out in post. But I think this was a good conversation. I think it's one of those things where everybody takes the CSM and everybody is aware of what the Scrum Master does. But in order to be truly transcendent and to get really good at what you do and actually move on to something of even more weight, these are definitely some things that I guarantee you they don't teach you in a lot of courses. The show notes alone, I'll send you a picture of my notes and all the boxes that I drew around things we're going to have to reference. I got a good 15 links we're going to have to put in here of topics and books and papers and stuff. But no, this was a good chat, and I definitely think we should do a part 2 where we start talking about the signs of Scrum Master dysfunction and how to fix it. I think that's probably the next step to go towards. When you spoke of self-reflection, right? Ask yourself, am I falling into these traps? Maybe 10 common traps a Scrum Master falls into and how to avoid them. That would be another interesting topic to learn on as well. Because like you said, if you go into a meeting and you know where your conflicts are going to be, same thing. If I'm becoming a Scrum Master and I know where the pitfalls are, I can learn to avoid them. Yeah, love it. I'll be happy to do that. Awesome. All right. Well, thanks, Jay. Appreciate it. Thank you, Troy. All right. This is Agile Uprising. Don't forget to check out our coalition at coalition.agileuprising.com. Hey, Jay, anything else you want to plug? I usually end every episode with plugging something not Agile related. So I will just end up throwing out that the band Vane just came out with their new album, their first LP, Error Zone, on Closed Casket Activities. And it is quickly in the running for me for Album of the Year. So check that out. I'm not going to describe it to you. But if you end up with blown eardrums, send me the medical bill and I'll figure out a way to pay for it. All right. Sounds good. Thanks, Jay. Thank you, Troy.